eventually pleaded guilty to the murder of Marshall University student Samantha Burns, who was 19 when she was kidnapped and killed.
2 weeks ago, the Q Center received another map from folks of the area. The convicted killer says that he and Brandon Basham buried their first victim, West Virginia College student Samantha Burns.
Chad Folks, who grew up in the tri-state area around Huntington, West Virginia, began dating an exotic dancer named Veronica Evans in April 2002. Shortly thereafter, Chad, who was then 25 years old, began living with Veronica and her 3-year-old son Miles in the eastern Kentucky community of Lewisburg. On June 11, 2002, they were married. Chad supported his new family in the same way he had supported himself for years by breaking into cars and stealing. And as he had with other women, he often became violent with her, sometimes beating her severely and assaulting her sexually. On August 25, 2002, Chad directed Veronica to use a stolen credit card to buy a necklace at a Walmart in Madisonville, Kentucky. Upon entering the store, she reported to police that he was in the parking lot with a gun and that she was afraid he would kill her. The police responded and searched their car, discovering, among other things, stolen credit cards and a pistol. The officers subsequently arrested both of them and transported them to the Hopkins County Detention Center. 3-year-old Miles was placed in foster care. On August 27, 2002, Chad agreed to cooperate with the government and was released from the detention center. On the basis of evidence seized from their home, he was ultimately charged with 12 counts of credit card fraud in Hopkins County, Kentucky. Brandon Basham had been housed at the HCDC on bad check charges for over a year when Chad arrived in late August 2002. According to guards at the prison, Brandon was disruptive and annoying, often pestering his fellow inmates. In order to protect him from other prisoners, Brandon was frequently reassigned cell mates, and, in mid-October 2002, he was placed in a cell with Chad. On November 3, 2002, after about 2 months in custody, the Kentucky State Police served Chad with an indictment charging him with first-degree abuse of a child aged 12 years or younger, Miles. The next evening, at approximately 6:30 p.m., a jailer released them, at Brandon's request, into an outdoor recreation area. The jailer became diverted administering medication to other inmates, and when she returned at about 8 p.m. to check on them, they were gone. They had escaped from the HCDC through the ceiling of the recreation area by using a makeshift rope made of blankets and sheets. By the following day, November 5, 2002, they had made their way on foot to the residence of James Hawkins, about 8 to 12 miles from the HCDC. Brandon approached the residence and, after using the phone, persuaded James to drive them to a nearby convenience store. Shortly after departing from the house, Hawkins agreed to drive them to their car, which they claimed to be located about 40 miles away in Robards, Kentucky. At some point, Brandon pulled a knife on James, and Chad ordered James to pull to the side of the highway so that Chad could drive. Soon thereafter, Chad stopped the truck on a remote state road, intending to abandon James. Brandon started to tie James to a tree, but Chad, dissatisfied with Brandon's effort, soon took over the job. Once Chad was convinced that James would be unable to escape, they departed in James's truck. James freed himself some 15 hours later, hailed a passing motorist, and called the police. According to his testimony at trial, although Brandon held him at knife point throughout the carjacking incident, Chad remained in charge, with Brandon merely following Chad's orders. After leaving James, they drove to Portage, Indiana, where, on November 6, 2002, they abandoned James's truck at a hotel and proceeded on foot to a trailer shared by Tina Severance and Andrea Roddy. Chad had met Tina at the Westville, Indiana, Correctional Institute in 2001, while he was serving time there and she was working as a correctional officer. After a few hours in the trailer, the men became very nervous, and the 4 of them traveled in Tina's van to the Sands Motel in northern Indiana, where they spent the next 2 nights. At some point while at the Sands Motel, Chad told Tina that he had escaped from prison because he feared a lengthy prison sentence on the pending child abuse charges. During their second night at the Sands Motel, Chad asked Tina if she knew where they could obtain firearms. She replied that a friend, Robert Talsma, kept firearms at his home in nearby Michigan City, Indiana. On the morning of November 8, 2002, in accordance with a preconceived plan, Tina and Andrea lured Robert away while Chad and Brandon broke into his home and stole several firearms, as well as a ring and some checks. The four of them then drove Tina's van to Sturgis, Michigan, where they rented a motel room. Brandon and Andrea spent the night of November 8, 2002, at the motel, while Chad and Tina spent that night in Goshen, Indiana, smoking marijuana and methamphetamine with Chad's brother, Ronnie Fulks. The next day, Chad and Tina returned to the Sturgis motel to find Brandon crouched on the floor holding a gun. Apparently convinced that the authorities had caught up with them, Brandon was highly agitated, repeatedly asserting that he was going to shoot a police officer. He eventually calmed down, and the four then drove to the Indiana home of Ronnie Fulks, where they spent the night. On November 10, 2002, the four of them, with Chad driving Tina's van, traveled to Piketon, Ohio, where they checked into a town and country motel. They then drove to a nearby Walmart, where Brandon wrote bad checks for items that Andrea later returned for cash. Also on November 10, 2002, at a Kmart in Piketon, Ohio, Chad met a young woman with a butterfly tattoo, later determined to be Heather Jacoby, with whom he used drugs. On that same date, Chad stole a purse and cell phone belonging to 19-year-old Amy Ward from a vehicle parked at a Walmart in Waverly, Ohio. On the following day, they drove to Canova, West Virginia, and rented a room at the Hollywood Motel. Both men then left the motel, not to return until the early morning hours of November 12, 2002. According to statements Chad made to the FBI in 2003, after they left the Hollywood Motel on November 11, 2002, they smoked methamphetamine and then drove to the Barboursville Mall, near Huntington, West Virginia, intending to break into cars and steal purses. When they arrived at the mall, they split up. The next time Chad saw Brandon, he was driving a car up and down the rows of the parking lot and yelling Chad's name. In the passenger seat was the owner of the car, a 19-year-old Marshall University student named Samantha Burns. After spotting Brandon, Chad returned to Tina's van and followed Brandon and Samantha to a Foodland grocery store, where Chad left the van and began driving Samantha's car. They then visited several automatic teller machines and withdrew cash from Samantha's account. They later returned to the Foodland to retrieve the van, at which point Brandon announced that he wanted to find a place to rape Samantha. Chad then followed Brandon in Tina's van to a secluded area by the Ohio River. Chad parked some distance from Samantha's car, and in such a way that his view of the passenger side of the car was obstructed. He observed Brandon exit the driver's side of the car and walk around to the passenger's side. He saw nothing else until about 20 minutes later when Brandon alone drove Samantha's car to where Chad was parked and informed Chad that he wanted to burn the vehicle in order to remove any fingerprints. After buying gasoline, Brandon set fire to the car on a rural road near Lavallette, West Virginia, and the men returned to the Canova Motel. From that point forward, Brandon wore, on a chain around his neck, a heart-shaped ring that was later determined to belong to Samantha. Although both men have admitted that Samantha is dead, her body has never been recovered. On November 12, 2002, the four of them drove the van to Little River, South Carolina, where Chad had lived during the late 1990s. During their trip to Little River, Brandon repeatedly taunted Tina by asking whether she wanted to go swimming in the Ohio River. Chad eventually ordered Brandon to stop teasing Tina, and Brandon complied. When the four of them arrived at Little River, they checked in at the Lake Shore Motel. Chad and Brandon spent the following day, November 13, 2002, breaking into cars and stealing purses. On November 14, the four left Little River for the Beach Walk Hotel in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. After checking in, Chad and Brandon left the hotel in Tina's van. At around 2 p.m. on November 14, 2002, Carl Jordan stumbled upon Chad and Brandon burglarizing his son's residence outside Conway, South Carolina. According to Carl, both men fired gunshots at him, with Chad shooting out the back window of Carl's truck. Carl then attempted to retreat in his truck, with Chad and Brandon following in Tina's van. They eventually gave up the chase, abandoned Tina's van, and stole a white pickup truck. They then made their way to a Walmart store in Conway, South Carolina, where, according to Chad's 2003 statements to the FBI, they planned to steal a car. At 2:37 p.m. that same day, a Walmart surveillance camera recorded a blue BMW driven by Alice Donovan enter the Walmart parking lot, with Chad and Brandon following closely behind. As Alice parked, Brandon exited the truck and approached the BMW while Chad circled the row of vehicles and parked opposite the BMW. Both vehicles then began moving again, traveling outside the range of the cameras. Chad soon abandoned the pickup truck and began driving the BMW, with Brandon and Alice in the back seat. After leaving the Walmart parking lot, they made several, some successful, attempts to withdraw money from Alice's account at various automatic teller machines. At some point, they crossed into North Carolina and stopped at a cemetery, where first Brandon and then Chad raped Alice. According to Chad's statements to the FBI, he did not want to rape Alice but felt pressure from Brandon to do so. They then re-entered South Carolina and, according to Chad, Brandon ordered him to stop along a dirt road so that they could leave Alice tied up, in order to prevent her from contacting the authorities. Chad complied with this request and Brandon, carrying a gun but no rope or tape that Chad could see, began leading Alice away from the car. Alice implored Chad to convince Brandon to leave the gun in the car, but Brandon refused to do so. Brandon then led Alice into the woods and out of Chad's sight. He returned 20 minutes later, alone. As with Samantha, both men have admitted that Alice was killed, but her body has never been found. Chad and Brandon then returned to the Beach Walk Hotel in Myrtle Beach, where they informed Tina and Andrea that the police were in possession of the van, and that Chad and Brandon needed to return to West Virginia alone. According to Chad, it was on their return journey to West Virginia that Brandon first informed him that he had killed Samantha and Alice. On November 15, 2002, they arrived in Huntington, West Virginia, and spent the next 2 nights smoking crack cocaine at the residence of Beth McGuffin, a friend of Chad's. Beth testified that, during the time she spent with them, Chad controlled what he and Brandon did. 2 days after arriving at Beth's home, on November 17, 2002, they drove to the Ashland Mall in nearby Ashland, Kentucky, where they planned to break into cars. At around 7:30 p.m., in the Ashland Mall parking lot, Brandon attempted to carjack Deanna Francis and her 15-year-old daughter. After Deanna reported the incident, a police officer spotted Brandon and began to pursue him on foot. Brandon initially eluded the officer by running behind some railcars, but he was apprehended at around 9 p.m. that evening, hiding across the railroad tracks in the Ohio River. Chad returned to Beth's home late that same evening and was there when the television stations reported Brandon's arrest. The following day, November 18, 2002, Chad left Huntington in Alice's BMW for his brother's home in Goshen, Indiana. That evening, an Ohio state trooper, having observed the BMW and ascertained that it was stolen, attempted to apprehend Chad at a rest area near Marion, Ohio. Following a highway chase reaching speeds of 130 miles per hour, Chad narrowly escaped. He arrived at his brother's home in Indiana on the evening of November 19, 2002, and, on the morning of November 20, 2002, hid the BMW in a barn near Bristol, Indiana. Police officers had earlier set up a surveillance operation at Chad's brother's home and, on the afternoon of November 20, 2002, after a brief foot chase, Chad was finally apprehended.